Let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm really excited to be introducing our distinguished guest tonight, Dr. Shawn Jones. I'm going to start with a little introduction and some logistics, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jones. I'm Liliana Lengua. I'm a professor in the UW Psychology Department and the director of the Center for Child and Family Wellbeing. And the mission of our center is to promote well-being in children and families through conducting and sharing research that promotes social and emotional well-being, mental health, and healthy relationships for children and the adults in their lives. One of the ways we do this is through public lectures like this evening's. First, I'm going to cover some logistics for the night. The chat is open, and you can use that to share thoughts and communicate with each other. You can also use the chat to let our team know if you're having any technical difficulties or if you notice any problems. We'll be monitoring that. If you have questions for Dr. Jones, please put that in the Q&A function or box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll use that to ask your questions of Dr. Jones at the end of the presentation. So we'll leave time at the end for questions. Please go ahead and type those in as you're thinking them or as they come to you so that they're ready to roll when his presentation is done. We are so lucky to have Dr. Jones with us tonight, not only because I'm incredibly excited about his presentation, but also because he's being very generous. He's on the East Coast, and over there it's 10 p.m. at night, and I would be in bed at this time, but he's here sharing his great work with us. So thanks, Shawn, for doing that. So let me take this chance to introduce Dr. Jones. He has pursued a uniquely interdisciplinary training path. He got his bachelor's degree in psychology at Duke University, went on to get a master's in public health at Johns Hopkins University, and then a Ph.D. in clinical psychology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He completed his internship at UCLA, where he spent an afternoon as a contestant on the Wheel of Fortune and won, and that on top of everything else he was doing. And then did a National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellowship in the University of Pennsylvania College of Education. He's currently an assistant professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. His expertise is in the well-being of Black youth and families, particularly in racial and ethnic protective factors, including racial socialization and identity and Afrocentricity, as well as the impact of racism-related stress and coping processes on youth well-being. His work is unique in that it combines quantitative and qualitative methodologies, and he focuses his work on a strengths-based approach that is grounded in ecological models. So acknowledging both individual contributions and macro system level contributions to youth well-being. And lastly, and importantly, as a scientist practitioner, his research endeavors are aimed at creating opportunities for prevention and promotion and intervention to support the well-being of youth, Black youth. So please help me or join me in welcoming Dr. Shawn Jones. Shawn, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lily. I really, really appreciate that introduction. And thank you all so much for being in attendance this evening. It is evening for us all, so maybe a little later evening for me, but evening nonetheless. So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to be with you all to present a bit on this work and just, again, my deepest gratitude and appreciation for CCFW for the invitation here. And so it's my hope that you all can see my slide deck and that's all good to go. I got a thumbs up. So going to spend some time this evening telling a bit of a story, building a bit of a conversation that I'm hoping we can engage in together that centers around what for many folks will quickly be a familiar refrain. And I'm actually have brought a special guest to kind of even introduce a little bit of the conversation that I'd like to invite us to engage in this evening, that centers around this notion of ways in which we can think about racial literacy. And I'll talk about what racial literacy is before we wrap up this evening, as a means of both understanding the experiences of racism and race-related stressors and traumas, as well as using racial literacy as a way to promote justice. So we're going to be talking about trauma, we're going to be talking about justice and a little bit of healing in our conversation this evening. So without further ado, let's get into it, shall we? Okay.
Amazing grace.
So we want to send our well wishes, of course, and our gratitude to former President Barack Obama for bringing us into conversation this evening. This video, this short clip, may be familiar to many of you all. You may have seen it several years ago. This is actually then President Obama getting ready to deliver a eulogy at the funeral for South Carolina State Senator Clcbe in 2015. Now, you may remember the name, or you may not remember the name of Clcbe as one of the individuals who was slain by Dylan Roof in Charleston, South Carolina. And so there is the messenger here, and then there is also the message. And so there is this hymn, this song that is being delivered here that talks about the notion of grace. Grace, right? This idea of unmerited favor, benefit, or some sort of benevolence. So I want to start off by talking about grace and placing grace in context for a second here. Here is the context. So in the video that we all just collectively watched, immediately after singing the first stanza to the classic hymn, Amazing Grace, former President Obama goes on to say that the 9 people that you see depicted on the left-hand side of your screen found amazing grace, that they found amazing grace. And it is here where I'm actually going to, maybe surprisingly to some, sit in tension with that notion. And I want to argue that I completely feel that the idea that 9 individuals slain by Dylan Roof found amazing grace is well-intentioned. But I also want to argue that that misses the mark somewhat, because it indicates that they found grace, this thing that we just saw defined as being undeserved, unmerited, spiritual, handed down, something that is kind of otherworldly or divine. But my question in response to that is, great that they found amazing grace, if that's what we want to say. But in the daily lives of Black, brown, and other marginalized folks in this country, is it not right that they deserve something more than grace? That they deserve perhaps justice? And so seeing this years ago and hearing this, it did something to me to think about what is the relationship between grace and justice. And so I wanted to make sure that I kind of did my homework and did my due diligence a bit. So let's take Amazing Grace and place it in some further kind of context. Okay. On the left-hand side is a song cover featuring one of the most iconic singers and indeed civil rights icons of our time in the United States context. And this is Mahelia Jackson. And some have argued that Mahelia Jackson's rendition of the hymn, Amazing Grace, is the most popular recorded version of this. It is this venerated, heralded Negro spiritual that Jackson herself is on record saying that she would sing Amazing Grace at various events during the civil rights movement as this talisman, as this charm to kind of ward off the evil realities that many civil rights leaders might have been facing. So to place Amazing Grace in further context, though, it is important that we fix our gaze to the right side of the screen. Who is John Newton? So while Mahalia Jackson certainly has the maybe the corner market on the most popular version of this hymn, it is actually John Newton who was the writer of Amazing Grace. A little bit about John Newton that's, I think, important here is that John Newton was an English slave trader who, and I don't mean this figuratively, found religion, literally, after nearly dying on a slave ship. As a slaver, emerging from that, we get the hymn Amazing Grace, and Newton goes on to speak out publicly to decry against the injustices of slavery at that time. And so we come back to these words that we just heard Obama echo not too long ago. This very famous first stanza, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. So again, we have this amazing otherworldly grace. Folks from the civil rights era, and particularly those who practiced nonviolence and those sorts of methodologies, certainly could be argued gave their fair share of grace. But the question to me still begs and still remains is like, where is justice in all of this? Where is justice in the lives of marginalized folks? So in contrast with grace, it is proper to define justice as the maintenance of things that are fair. And one of the things I want to particularly highlight here is that justice is not only defined as being fair, but it is also defined as being something that is merited, something that is deserved, either good in the case of rewards or less good in the case of punishments. So you may be saying, Shawn, where are you going with this? How are you connecting Amazing Grace and justice? How are you connecting this first stanza with this all? And my answer is it comes down to how we think about justice in this context and in our current context and our historical context as well. And so upon doing a little bit further homework, came across a discussion of how justice is often depicted, particularly in our legal context, right? This idea of Lady Justice, as you see depicted on the screen, this symbol of impartiality, even noted by two things: holding scales for justice to be balanced and fair, and in particular, wearing a blindfold, right? So this idea of blind justice that is supposed to represent, again, this impartiality, the idea that justice is supposed to be applied without regard to wealth, without regard to power, without regard to other forms of status. The problem with justice, as it's defined there, is this notion that in order for us to be impartial, the impartiality of justice demands of us a refusal to see, to be kind of blindfolded proverbially, to have what is often referred to as this intentional blindness to what is going around within context. Now, as relevant for the conversation that we're building towards, as we think about the ideas of racial literacy, I want to note that from a legal perspective, we often can think about blind justice, but that this just as equally translates into the way that we think about health, mental health, wellness, well-being. And indeed, psychologists and social scientists have donned this construct, developed this construct known as racial colorblindness. Racial colorblindness. This notion that is typified by things like unawareness of racial privilege, unawareness of discrimination, unawareness of things that are blatantly racial, that all concretize around a belief that race not only does not matter, but that it should not matter when we think about the lived experience of folks. So it's kind of feeding into this idea, right? So I thought it might be helpful for us to unfold and unpack a little bit about what might be some of the pitfalls of taking a racial colorblindness approach as it pertains to the lived experiences, the health realities of Black and Brown folks in this country. And so what I decided to do was to engage the artwork here of a sculptor by the name of Diana Moore. And so what I really appreciate about Diana Moore's sculptures, she was commissioned across many parts of the country to erect these sculptures that are to depict blind justice. And what Moore is quoted as saying is that these depictions, and we're going to look at a couple of them, were intentionally ambiguous with regard to gender, age, ethnicity of these figurines as a way of embracing the diversity of American society. So let's look at some of the places and spaces where we can find Moore's racially gendered, ambiguous sculptures of justice. And let's hold those in tension with what we find in these places and spaces. So the first place you can see on the screen here, this particular sculpture is right outside of a courthouse in Newark, New Jersey. So I dug a little bit. I said, well, what's going on in Newark, New Jersey here that might be relevant, might be salient here? And I came across this report called Unprecedented and Unequal, racial inequities in the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what you are seeing on the screen is a graphic that is showing a number of different variables. So you can see rate of contracting COVID-19, rate of hospitalization, and ultimately, and unfortunately, mortality rates. Now, importantly, what you're seeing here are age-adjusted versions of each of the rates that I outlined. And so the headline, the kind of takeaway here is in the title, which is that in the state of New Jersey, this report came out last year, indicated that when we account for age, Black and Latinx residents are showing 2 to 3 times far more deleterious outcomes as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this virus that ostensibly, right, engages folks, it's respiratory, it's airborne, ... But we're seeing in New Jersey, for example, that there are these racial inequities that can't be explained away by age, by socioeconomic status per se, ... right? That are maybe due to bigger, more intractable issues that are going on. Okay. Let's move a little bit, shall we, to New Hampshire. This is another one of Moore's great commission works here. And this again is outside of one of our great legal spaces, this time again outside of Concord, New Hampshire. So I was curious to see, well, what's going on in and around Concord, New Hampshire as it pertains to justice, as it pertains to thinking about racial issues. And so I was struck by 2 particular headlines about a year apart, both in the beginning of 2020 and then the beginning of last year. And so at the top, what we see is that in the beginning of 2020, the New Hampshire Supreme Court released a historic decision that noted that race needed to be considered in the context of police encounters, needed to be considered as it pertains to understanding whether or not individuals felt like they had the right to leave, that they were free to leave, right? Do you feel like you were being seized? Do you feel like you were free to go? And the impetus for this particular ruling arose after New Hampshire as a state noted that Black folk in New Hampshire were nearly 3 times more likely to be arrested relative to white people in the state. Okay. The second headline, the AP headline here, I found equally interesting. This is at the beginning of last year. And what I found was that a number of individuals that were a part of a diversity council that was commissioned by the governor of New Hampshire quit. They resigned their position on the diversity council. And I was like, this is really curious. What's going on here? And so digging a little bit deeper, what those folks who resigned argued was that there were budget cuts, that there were provisions that were made in the New Hampshire state budget that limited the discussion of systemic racism and other related topics. So systemic racism, sexism, gender. This may sound familiar to some of you all as we are watching the national landscape around the discussion of critical race theory and the implications for how and whether or not that is even discussed in school settings, particularly K through 12 settings, and a lot of the legislation that is coming out. Perhaps we can think most recently what's going on down in Florida, for example, in the context of conversations and discussions around sexual orientation, gender identity, right? So again, I'm trying to understand and eke out the benefits of keeping this blindfold on into what's going on through a racial lens. And so that brings me to my third and final sculpture. This is aesthetically for me, I find this particular sculpture to be particularly impressive. And this version of Blind Justice is actually sitting outside of a legal space in Lafayette, Louisiana. Probably guessed it right now. Dr. Jones, Shawn did a little digging, and I said, well, what is happening in Louisiana these days as it pertains to our topics before us this evening? And so I was, and I apologize for the strong language here, but I was appalled to see that recently there was an educator in a school district in Lafayette, Louisiana, in the parish down there, who refers to a mostly Black and brown part of the parish, the area, as N-Wordville. You can see it on the screen. And so this teacher was disciplined and eventually let go. But what I thought was particularly interesting here is that you may see that Miss Coley here was an employee at Osun Elementary. Interestingly, Miss Coley, prior to her being let go, was not only a teacher, but was also in charge of the school's discipline, in charge of who was suspended, who was expelled, et cetera, and so forth. Now, the student population was 64% students of color, 45% Black. And we have an educator here who, on a Facebook page, refers to a part of town where many of her students live as N-Wordville, saying she would not be there. And so when I saw this particular headline, I couldn't help but draw a comparison between this story, pretty explicit in your face use of, racially insensitive language, with more insidious, implicit forms of bias that we see coming out of the work of Walter Gilliam and his colleagues at Yale. And so some of you all who were at my conversation this afternoon have seen this graphic. But for those who have not, this graphic by Gilliam talks about eye tracking data that was used in preschool settings to better understand where teachers are devoting their gaze, where teachers are focusing their gaze. And so my takeaway from that was, if we combine this explicit racism from a teacher like Miss Cawley, and we mix it with the implicit bias that we see, the unintentional bias that we see from educators, that could be doubly damning, doubly traumatic for Black and brown youth. So when I think about the disproportionate suffering and racial trauma that we saw in different parts of the country at different times, it is clear to me then that we need something, not just justice, which is what I initially set out to say, but maybe we need a specific form of justice, not just justice in a general sense, but the need for racial justice. Okay, this way to treat people equitably across race, right? Whether we do that in our policies, what folks are allowed to talk about, who feels safe when they get pulled over, who is perishing at different rates from a pandemic virus, and who is educating the youth will also control what is being said and who is being disciplined, right? So when we think about perspectives of what can bring about justice, what can bring about racial justice, there are arguably two perspectives in taking up racial justice. One comes aligned, not uniquely calling out Chief Justice Roberts, but one perspective around racial justice might be summed up by a kind of popular perspective that Chief Roberts offered previously. This idea, as offered in 2007, that the way to stop discrimination, the way for there to be racial justice, is if we stop discriminating on the basis of race. So the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. So this idea that in order to kind of overcome, if we really want to overcome, get to justice, we just need to stop engaging this race talk, right? A second perspective is argued by another Supreme Court justice, this time Justice Sotomayor, who actually in direct response to Roberts noted, and I quote, that the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to speak openly and candidly on the subject of race and to apply the Constitution with eyes open to the unfortunate effects of centuries of racial discrimination. So this actually was 7 years later. It was in the context of Michigan and affirmative action ban. You may have heard of it, right? But the idea here is that there are different ways that some of us think we can tackle the issue of racial justice, right? I tend to side, maybe not surprisingly, with what you see on the screen as offered by Justice Sotomayor. To say that racial justice is not only something that is necessary, right? But if justice is merited, then racial justice is something that is owed. It is something that Black and brown folks, marginalized folks deserve. And furthermore, right, that racial justice, in order for us to get there, it is going to require that we are intentional in bringing awareness to racism in its many forms, as well as the role that we, all of us, play in racial politics and racial polemics, right? And so this is the second part of that stanza, but now I see, right? How do we engage in intentional awareness, intentional recognition of what is going on around us? My response then is that it requires us to take up a perspective of racial literacy. Now, racial literacy was initially defined by Franz Twine and has kind of been deeply taken up by one of my personal mentors, Dr. Howard Stevenson, who really kind of takes this perspective of racial literacy and identifies it as this kind of tripartite, as this threefold approach to engaging around racial moments, right? This ability, Stevenson argues, to be able to read recast, and resolve racial encounters, racial moments. So reading, right? Being able to kind of decode, to understand the scripts, the subscripts, the subtext of what is going on in a racial environment, to recast, which is this ability to take the mountain and reframe it to more of a molehill. And ultimately, this idea of resolution, right? This ability to negotiate, to bring into sharp relief, right? Racially traumatic moments, whether they're individual or systemic, to bring to ultimately a healthy, a healing closure. So racial literacy, again, is ways in which we as individuals can be intentional about seeing and recognizing the racial jungle around us, to being able to make sense of that landscape and to engage that landscape in ways that are healthy for all. Okay. Now I'm not going to just leave us there. We're going to actually, all of us, in just a short few moments, are going to take a bold step, a foray into trying to wrap up in the remainder of our time today with at least taking a step towards engaging racial literacy in a true way. Okay. And to kind of prepare us to engage in this work, I'm going to present one more set of places of injustice that have kind of recently, in the last half year or so, kind of come to my attention. And, this is the Center for Child and Family Wellbeing. So the scene of a pediatric emergency space, for me as a child and family psychologist is not something that when I first look at it, gives me too much to think about other than, I hope the child is okay. What I've learned in some recent data that I think is pretty troubling is concerning some injustices that we see happening even in pediatric emergency spaces. So I want to highlight two pieces of research that came out towards the end of last year. So the first talks about injuries to youth, children and adolescents, by law enforcement. This is a 12-year study looking at California emergency departments. And what they found was that Black boys and girls between the ages of 10 and 14 were injured at 5.3 and 6.7 times the rate for white boys and girls by law enforcement. So again, in California emergency departments, youth 10 to 14 and Black youth much more, right, in greater numbers are showing up to ED departments due to injuries sustained from engaging with law enforcement. We take a plane to the other side of the country, and right around this same time comes out a report published around September of last year in JAMA Pediatrics that looks at 11 emergency departments across New England between 2013 and 2020. And what they find is that Black pediatric patients were 2 times more likely to receive physical restraint than white children in these ED settings. So these physical hands, legs tied down in ED, ER departments, right? And so this really struck me when I was thinking about this work, because on the one hand, you have youth who are coming into these spaces due to at least some disparity in what's going on outside in engagement with law enforcement, right? And then in an unrelated, right, scene, youth who share that same racial identity, once they're in these ED departments, are experiencing more severe treatment that is not typical necessarily of pediatric patients per se. And so what I was struck by in holding these two pieces of research and conversation was actually a compelling quote that was offered by the lead researcher of the second JAMA pediatric study, Dr. Destiny Tolliver. And what Dr. Tolliver said was that when Black children are perceived as adults, they lose the benefit of the doubt that is granted to children, and it increases the perception of them as a threat. It increases the perception of them as a threat. So it is here that I actually am going to invite us all to engage in a bit of what I call kind of courageous reflection, which is a big part of the notion of intentional seeing, of racial literacy. I'm going to offer a prompt in just a few short seconds on the screen, and I'm going to give you all 1 minute to just reflect on the prompt. Okay, that's all I want you to do. I'm going to show the prompt, and I want you to spend 60 seconds reflecting on the prompt. Okay, here we go. What if a child that you love came to you after being racially rejected, disrespected, or misperceived? What is it that you would say to them? What is it that you would say to them? Okay, I'm going to start the timer over here. We all get 60 seconds. Please take some time to reflect. Okay. Okay, thank you all so much for engaging in that. So I'm actually going to ask one more thing of you. I'm actually going to ask if you might be so kind as to kind of reflect on the question on the next screen here. So what I'm going to invite you to do at this time, you can either take out your handy dandy smartphone and you can open up your handy dandy camera app and you can hold it over that QR code and it'll pop up this interactive word cloud. If what I just said sounds way too ridiculous and fancy smanchy, I invite you to simply go into a browser and type, somebody got it already, thank you, and type Slido, SLIDO.com, and then just type in the hashtag CCFW. And you can start to provide your reflections, and I appreciate them that are already coming in. And you are able to put more than one word, feeling, phrase. Mhm. I'm going to give it just a couple more seconds here. And please, as I resume talking, you are welcome to please keep engaging and sharing in. We appreciate this. So I want to start to kind of unpack what I'm seeing here. For those of us who may not be as familiar with this particular way of showing information, this is a word cloud, by another name. And the thing about word clouds, for us who are not maybe necessarily initiated or as familiar, is that the words that appear actually larger and bolder usually appear that way because they have been endorsed by either multiple times or by multiple people. And so our eyes may be drawn towards sadness, as it's kind of the big node in the middle there, and see things like anger and frustration, overwhelm. But I'm also hoping that we see things like protective, like empathy, right? I also see really cool things. I love this every time, right? So lots of thinking on how to sustain, love, and teach. I also want to point out, and then we'll move on, things like tears, things like sick to my stomach. And I appreciate you all for engaging in this work, because this reflection, this 1 minute that generated these feelings, these different words and perspectives, give us insight into the work of racial literacy. How do we make sense of, right, our experiences, either envisioning or actually living through and with the racial narratives and perspectives that surround us? And so I'm going to now open up to a bit of a tool that my colleagues and I at the University of Pennsylvania really often kind of bring into sharp relief when thinking about racial literacy. And that is, I see the word practice here too. So that is this notion, of a skill called CLCBE. It's an acronym that stands for calculate, locate, communicate, breathe, and exhale. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time here before we wrap up introducing CLCBE to all of us, okay? And we can think about this as almost a sort of mindfulness tool, a way in which the next time that you turn on the TV and you see something that's unjust, or you are walking down the street minding your business and someone crosses the street unknowingly, or you are the person who feels the urge to cross the street unknowingly, to think about how to navigate racial encounters. Okay. So the first C in CLCBE stands for calculate. And so when my colleagues, Dr. Stevenson, Rihanna Anderson, and others, when we invite folks to calculate, we are asking folks to name the emotions, to name the feelings that are associated with the moments like the prompt that I gave you all. Are you feeling anger? Are you feeling confusion, fear? We want you to not just name the feelings, but also to rate the intensity of those feelings. So on a scale from 1 to 10, how angry, how confused, how scared are you feeling? Okay, the idea being that the more that we can identify and pay attention to how we're feeling, then we have an opportunity, right, to truly recognize what is going on, and then from there be able to recast and resolve. So this is all part of kind of the reading piece of it. The second part of CLCBE is the L. It stands for locate. So after you have identified the emotions that you're feeling, I want to invite you to notice where on your feelings, as some of you all, where on your body, as some of you all did, you're feeling those emotions. So some folks said tears. Some folks said sick to my stomach. Some folks said, knots in my stomach, or butterflies, or I feel like I can't breathe, right? Really trying to get as descriptive as possible to process what you're feeling. The next part of this particular strategy, this racial literacy strategy, is to communicate. So to identify what is coming up for you, what words, what imagery comes to your mind. I saw things like seen it too many times before, talking to my inner child, right? Dealing with this again. Am I racist? What are the words? What are the images that are coming to your mind? Are you feeling optimistic? Are you feeling like things can change or that they're just going to stay the same? Right? And then lastly, right, Clcbe recognizes that the realities of seeing, of noticing, can be stressful, right? So I'm making an argument that it's important for us to see and recognize the role that we play racially in moments and how that could impact marginalized folks. But we also recognize that that can be stressful. It can be stressful for folks who are living and reliving that. So it's important throughout these moments to remember to breathe. If I ask you all right now, how many of you all were breathing through that reflection? I bet a number of folks would be like, yeah, I really wasn't being mindful of my breath. I really, that was like a punch to the gut. And we hear that too often. And so you're invited to breathe in and to exhale, right, as you engage around this work. So I'm gonna try it. Not gonna just introduce this and leave you all. And I know I can't see you all, but I'm gonna ask us to engage in another moment of reflection. Okay. So I'm gonna give us 90 seconds this time. I want you to spend the first 45 seconds or so reflecting. And then I want you to spend the next 45 seconds or so kind of walking yourself through Clcbe, remembering importantly to breathe and exhale at the end. Okay. So this particular engagement, this reflection, I want to ask you all to please reflect on a memory wherein you became aware of your membership in a racial or ethnic group. So reflect on the first time that you remember being aware of your membership in your racial or an ethnic group or groups. Okay. All right. Still have about 45 seconds. So start to calculate what you're feeling as you're reflecting on that. Notice where you're carrying that in your body. What are you hearing internally? What is your internal self-talk? And then I'm going to trust us all that we are going to give a hearty inhale and exhale at the end. So I am going to, again, trust that we all did that. And I'm going to volunteer myself for tribute. And I'm going to share my response to that as we kind of close our time this evening. So I want to kind of introduce you. This is not actually me, y'all, by the way. But I want to introduce you to a version of me that can reflect back on this particular moment when I first recognized in some way that I was a member of my racial ethnic group, that I was Black, that I was a Black boy. And my mother, and for context, my mother probably was the person who taught me the words to Amazing Grace. I'm almost sure that that's true. And my mother took me to the grocery store. And, I was just being a little 4-year-old and kind of bouncing around and trying to like convince my way to the candy or the sugary cereal or what have you. And I got in the way of an older white woman. And that older white woman leaned over and told my mother that she needed to get her little N-word out of the way. And yeah, and so my mom grabbed me and put me on the other side of the shopping cart, and we finished our grocery shopping endeavor and then got in the car, and my mom started to cry. And then started to teach me and talk to me about race and what had just kind of happened and what that meant. Now in the work that I do, right, we have codified this as a construct known as racial socialization. So we have this fancy construct word for having the conversations about the reality of being a problem due to the color of your skin. And this very experience, has inspired the work that I and my colleagues are doing and have been doing across methods and across mediums. The central node of the work that we take up is to focus on seeing, on noticing, on deeply understanding the realities of racism as a traumatic stressor within families, but also seeing, noticing, and understanding the responses that families have to this racism. And so this work that we do, right, we quite literally take this up in the ways in which we work with families, we engage families around conversations, right? So some of the work that we do is asking families to imagine, just like you all were asked to reflect on these two hypothetical scenarios. Well, one of them was real, right? And maybe two of them were real for some of you all. But we ask families to reflect, for example, on what would they do if their child is privy to the next Tamir Rice, to the next Trayvon Martin, to the next Mahelia Bryant, right? What will they do, right? How will they talk to their kids about that? How will they be forced to see, to recognize, to have a conversation, right? We also, right, engage families in this idea of understanding what they're noticing, what they're talking about, what they're seeing in the environment, right? In their school settings. We talked about some of that work, right? And then what is being taught, right? What are the ways in which Black families, brown families are taking up work of restoring dignity and teaching folks to be proud of their hair, their looks, etc. This intentional seeing in the work that I and my colleagues do cause us to understand ways in which parents of multiple ethnic groups. So in this particular instance, what you're seeing here are items that we asked to nearly 1,000 Black, white, Latinx, and Asian American families to understand the value that they see in courageous racial literacy and being able to say, wait, these are the realities that are going around. And how do I talk and teach and engage and share my emotions with my children, be they Black, Latinx, Asian, or white? How skillfully am I able to do that? And what does that mean for my child's benefit? Right? In each of these instances, right, we are taking up this work, right, to better understand how we can move from seeing and understanding and recognizing towards an ultimate arc of justice and healing, right? This work, which I can talk about in Q&A, is another example of this, looking at diverse families again, right? Across the spectrum of multiculturalism, to understand these things. So I want to bring us back as I close to the notion of Amazing Grace, the issue that I take with Amazing Grace. This, again, for those who are familiar with the hymn, is also going to be maybe a familiar refrain. I'm going to read it. It says, through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. Okay. So again, I hope it's clear here, but I have appreciation for Amazing Grace, for grace, right? But it is important to note that Amazing Grace is not the same thing as racial justice, right? We cannot, right, rest on Black and brown folks getting it from some other space. We can't rest on the fact that injustices can be inflicted upon Black and brown folk and that they will hand out and extend grace to those who have privilege. That is not justice. We have to move towards racial justice. And I argue, and I hope that I've been able to make an argument that in order for us to move from grace to justice, from Amazing Grace to racial justice, we have to engage in intentionally seeing and speaking to the realities of the racial lived experience of all of us, speaking healing, right? For our children, for our adolescents, for adults, for families, right? So yes, it may be the case that grace has brought us this far, but it is my hope that in the work that we do and the way that we live, that it is justice that is ultimately going to lead us home towards healing in schools and hospitals and prisons and all of these various settings, okay? And so as I close up and wrap this evening, I want to just leave you with a question to ponder. Oh, say, can you and will you see? Thank you so much for your time. And I would be happy to take any questions at this moment. Thank you.
Wow. 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 I know that if we were in a room full of people right now, we'd be waiting a few moments for the applause. So I'm just going to give it a moment of applause here. Too bad we can't turn on their mics. Thank you, Shawn. I just want to say, wow, we're getting comments. Thank you for walking us on this, you called it a story at the beginning, this path from grace to justice, to racial justice, to racial literacy, courageous reflection. I'm inviting people to write questions in the Q&A. There's one there.
Yeah.
We'll start with that, but I also just want to highlight the thank yous and the applause in the chat that you're getting.
Thank you all. I appreciate it. And,
So the question is, great lecture, thank you. Do you have any advice for how to communicate or even change a person, group, or department that thinks they are racially literate, but are actually not, that are actually more detrimental to recasting and resolving racial stress and trauma?
Yeah, that is a really, really good and deep question that we received. Thank you so much for it. So, I'm going to provide an answer, and it may be unsatisfactory. My true thought is that engaging, so I think that the true test of racial literacy is connected to something that I talked about this morning with some of Dr. Lily's students, which was this idea of humility. And what I hear in that response, the first thing that came to my mind when I heard that question was that truly there is a connection between what I would say is kind of humility, cultural humility, and racial literacy. Meaning that truthfully, there are always going to be racial moments that are going to require us to see and see again, to understand anew. And so I think the haughtiness, the arrogance, and this is cross-racial ethnic, by the way, that can come is that this idea that I've seen this before, right? And yes, there is a part of racial literacy, particularly as it pertains to the health and wellness of marginalized folks, that we want to get our youth to, when they do see familiar scripts, to be able to recognize them. And then to be able to say, I remember this experience. I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to kind of recast this. I'm going to find a healthy way to get to this. But the flip side of that is that, particularly as institutions, if we feel that we've seen it all and we've done it all, and we've gotten kind of big and that, as you said, is detrimental to that healing. And so what I would question, or what I would encourage, is to engage the individual, the institution, to really reconsider and courageously re-engage their perception of being racially literate, right? Because to me, racial literacy without humility. So for what I'm saying is, if I'm racially literate and someone comes to me and says, hey, actually, you're really microaggressing left and right here. You think you got it down, but this is a diverse space, but there is no inclusion, no equity, no justice, right? if I'm truly at a place of racial literacy, I should be able to non-defensively hear that, receive that, and respond in kind to that. And so I think that it starts with being able to really, like, I know that I presented it maybe quickly and it sounded a little trite, but like really doing the work of having courageous engagement around these topics is vulnerable. When we do these conversations in school districts, in various settings where we do this work, people are crying. People are like, and not that that's the goal, but the idea being is that there is a level of vulnerability and honesty here with oneself and with others that is not a checkbox thing. And so the work is deeper than that. So I would encourage folks to really engage those individuals, those institutions, if you have the power and the space to do so, to really say, hey, can we come back to the drawing board? Can we engage in some courageous conversations about ways in which we might be missing the mark here, and ways in which you, my partner, my colleague, et cetera, might be missing the mark here? And can we come with a shared understanding that at the end of this arc is not a gotcha, it's not a one-ups person, but it's really about healing, about equity, about justice. And if that's the lens through which we view the ultimate goal, then we come to that with in a space of humility. And I think that gets us further along. I'm sorry, I know that was a long-winded question.
Not at all. It does make me think, there is another question in the Q&A, but it makes me think that the hardest part of this is cultivating that seeing, reflection, humility, when that's not where people start or maybe want to go. I don't, I've seen lots of trainings and, thinking about this, like, how do you do this racial socialization with adults, with people who are like already set in their ways, and cultivate that seeing and re-seeing and humility.
Yeah, I see the questions. I'll answer those too. I just want to respond to that because it's a really good point. I think that it comes with one of the things that we often talk about is that at least undergirding, and we can see this in a broader global context. I won't get political here any more than I just did for 60 minutes, but at underlying a lot of what we're talking about comes down to humanity and inhumanity. And so for me, one way to go there with people who are reticent, people who are quote unquote set in their ways, is to just ask the question of, like, just imagine that it is someone you love. And just how would you engage that? Like, okay, you think that color doesn't matter. Okay, fine. Someone is denigrating someone you love. How do you engage that? When have you felt othered? How do you engage that? If we start with these kind of common experiences, then it kind of can help folks to kind of break down some of those barriers. And I think that's important. So I'm going to try to answer these questions as I see them. So one question is, how would you explain that colorblindness is not a good thing when they think it is the best way to be? Yeah. So, I think that the way that I will answer that is to say that I think that for a fair majority of folks, color blindness is a very well-intentioned approach. And it is the notion, to me, it is literally, as the name suggested, it's why I took the pain to try to unfold this narrative, is that if I put the proverbial blindfold on, right, if I filter through that lens, then things will be better. Right. And so to me, that's well-meaning. Like, okay, you want things to be right. You want things to be fair. And to you, if we de-emphasize talking about difference, then that's one way to get to things being better. Right. I think that the potential shortcoming there is that while well-intentioned, right, it leads us to to erase at best, right? Or to downplay at best, to erase at worst, the realities and experiences of folks. And so to me, right, I would just come from that perspective. And that's not a one-time conversation to have, but I think by really kind of coming to it like, okay, I think starting by saying, I see, no pun intended, I see where you're coming. I see where you're coming from with that perspective. And I see how, like, gosh, it would be great if that were the case. But what are the implications if you're wrong? And that it's not just the case that we can just assume that we don't see race, and so not seeing race makes racism go away. What if that's not true? What are the implications of that? And then how do we reconcile that? So I think that's a question, I think that's a conversation, a multi-level conversation, but hopefully that's helpful. I see a really big question here that I'm not going to avoid. That says, what is a number one thing that that University of Washington could be doing to bring racial justice? I'm not gonna deeply punt that, but what I'm gonna say is it would be irresponsible of me, without having a deep appreciation of the historical and contemporary realities of that department, I wouldn't want to make an offhand perspective. But what I will say is something that I think is universal when this question arises, is that you are willing to like, seeing and hearing in this way kind of go side by side. So being open to acknowledging the realities, the pain, the experiences, the historical residue that may exist in your institution is a good first step. Being willing to hold space for these sorts of conversations and dialogues is important. And I feel that many institutions, again, I don't know this to be specifically true, but many institutions that I have walked through, that I have been a part of, that I have a role in playing in this, many institutions want to operate from a perspective of racial colorblindness, which is actually even more problematic than individuals operating from that perspective, because then we don't make time for it. It's not important. It's an afterthought. It's the diversity brown bag that nobody comes to. It manifests in those different ways. And so that is something, hopefully, that is a partial response to that really important question. Yeah.
Thanks. That's great. There's another question. I don't know if you're seeing that too. What advice do you have for caregivers who are raising BIPOC children when they themselves are not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what I would recommend is, I'm going to give like a quicker resource and then kind of unpack a bit more in the interest of time. So 2 things I would encourage you to type into a search engine. One is a site and a platform called Embrace Race. Embrace Race. It is actually was started by they come to be really good friends of mine, but really excellent folks. It is an interracial couple who are raising youth, and they have kind of really put together a nice coalition of practitioners, researchers, and it's a big parent support group at the end of the day, caregiver support group that tackles these questions in a really good way. It has a bevy of resources. So Embrace Race is definitely one space that I would check out. Another is the American Psychological Association has a racial ethnic socialization initiative that I was fortunate to be a consultant on in the early days. So APA, Racial Ethnic Socialization Initiative, if you put that's a mouthful, but if you put that into your search engine, there are a ton of books, podcasts, et cetera, and so forth that go through painstaking conversations about how to have these conversations. I think, the other last little thing I'll say there is just to like speak life to the obvious, that like, hey, there are ways in which I'm not going to have some of the experiences you had, but here are my experiences, and here is how I care about and love you, and ... And just being kind of honest and vulnerable there, I think is always a great first start.
That's great.
Sam, I see your question. So if you may have noticed at the very bottom of the kind of cards that I was walking through, Clcbe, again, something that I've been, very fortunate to be a part of as a part of the Racial Empowerment Collaborative, and now Lion's Story. So like the animal Lion's Story, which are both directed by Dr. Howard Stevenson at the University of Pennsylvania. So if you type in Lion's Story, you can get access to the Clcbe deck. And there are trainings there. There are other ways, including Howard's TED Talk, about how you can kind of continue these sorts of courageous reflections.
Yeah, that courageous reflection is a powerful piece. I appreciated you doing that. And it just really, when you define racial literacy, the ability to read, recast, resolve racial stress and trauma, and you said it a few times, seeing, noticing, and responding. These are skills and tools that take a lot of practice, and bringing awareness to that. So the courageous reflection is a really great tool for that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It definitely takes practice. So that's the one regret I have about presenting this work the way that I did, because again, I want to be very clear. If I had my druthers, I'd be, if we all had our druthers, not just me, I would have just given that conversation and we'd be in the same space, and we would have taken some time and slowed down, and that stuff, as you just said, Dr. Lingwood, it really does take time. It really is not as easy as just spending 2 minutes reflecting and like, I got my racial literacy certificate. And so again, to circle back to that lack of humility about how much it takes to really go there and go deeper will not serve any of us. So practice, reflect, have these conversations with loved ones, with colleagues, with your children, if you feel so able to do so, because that practice is really what kind of works that ability to kind of read, recast, and resolve.
Yeah. I think what I heard you just say is that you're open to coming back and actually doing a longer, deeper training with us. Did I hear that? Is that what I heard?
I would be happy to do such a thing. That would be awesome. Would be really great to come out to the Pacific Northwest. Yeah,
that'd be great. Okay, and then I think we have time for one or two more questions. That how do we start to address this misperception that treating everyone with kindness or equally is not the same as racial equity?
Yeah, that's a good one. So I personally think that, this is just Shawn speaking, I personally, in my work and in my life, have again started from a perspective of what is the benefit for a person holding that perspective. So I try to start from understanding. And to me, when I see things, and I have people in my very own family who have this perspective, right? They're like, it's not, it's not colorblindness, just treat everyone with kindness. And that, I think one of the things that Howard, my dear mentor, says often is that sometimes folks get into the business of talking about racial literacy and in these conversations as a matter of goodness, of, I don't want to be bad, I want to be good. And so if I treat everybody just kind and being good, then that's good. Right. But if we see it as a matter of not just being moral, but if we see it as if we look at the health implications, if we look at the like justice implications beyond, which is a deeper version of morality, right? Then I think that takes us to a different place. And it takes us to me, then we're able to engage in conversations that say, if we follow your way to its logical conclusion, and we just right now from today, we just treat everyone the same. I don't disagree that is going to take us part of the way, but then what do we do about the realities of that, the fact that equal treatment and equitable treatment aren't the same thing? And so, then we start getting out the graphics, I'm sure that everyone's seen, of people at the baseball game and they're standing on different things and there's ramps and stuff, right? But at the heart of all of those conversations is, I think if you're on a one-on-one level trying to engage the work, it starts with acknowledging that there is some merit to the person's perspective, right? I hope I did that. I'm always shuddering my boots that one day I'm gonna maybe talk about this, and then someone's gonna be like, "Oh yeah, if I'm so lucky, like former President Obama is on there, right?" Like, we can hold intention. Like, I have great honor and respect. There's merit there, and that takes us so far. So I really think that it starts with not saying like I'm more woke or more ... than you. It starts with saying like, I understand where you're coming from, and can we come alongside and think about ways in which this well-meaning argument may fall short for certain folks, and then what do we do with that? How do we hold that intention? I hope that helps.
That's great. I think there's a last comment here. Is colorblindness a way of gaslighting people's experiences?
So my quick answer to that is yes, but not always. Again, I do think that there are a number of folk who I actually think that most folk who adopt a colorblind ideology are well-meaning. I don't think it's intended. I don't think most folks are being nefarious or trying to gaslight. I think that most folks are really well-meaning, and most folks who I think adopt a colorblind ideological perspective, see the world as they hope it would be, and the way that maybe one day it will be. But my just retort is always like, dang it, we're just not there just yet. So yes, so that's my perspective. Yes, there are some folks who may use it as gaslighting. There are some folks for whom it may be a dog whistle. I would say, actually, though, I don't, again, try to not be too political. I don't think that actually it's super helpful to come from that angle, because I don't think that that's the largest cross section of folks who take up that perspective. I think most folks are well-meaning and wish that we could live in a society, in a space where having a colorblind stance would be necessary and sufficient. And unfortunately, I just personally don't feel, and I don't know that the research necessarily on colorblind ideology supports that it is sufficient.
Yeah. I mean, I think that connects with the kindness question before it, and that it's, that maybe on an individual level, and you maybe believe that and can act in that way, but that's not changing the systems and the institutions and the inequity across, multiple contexts, and it's not addressing that part of it. So missing the bigger picture, I think. Well, this has been incredible. Thank you. Really thought-provoking, and thank you for taking us into that deep place of courageous reflection, and calling us to order, calling us to challenge and do that work. I really appreciate it. And again, if we were in a room full of people, you'd be hearing the resounding applause of appreciation. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you, Shawn, for staying up so late and delivering this really moving and profound presentation.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. I do want to, I was scrolling in the comments. I want to make one last comment. Oops, not wrong side. This button here, who someone has called out a couple times. I do want to just say that there is, I don't know if there's necessarily justice, but there's definitely healing and joy. And so I do think, I want to plus one what someone said in the chat, which is that we often get on here, and I said this earlier in another talk, and we start to play this violin of like the traumas and tragedies of the world. And those exist, and it's important to notice those. It is also important to speak life, to celebrate joy, to embrace that, to hold space for that as well. And so I would be remiss if I didn't close with, that's why I wear this. I wear this as a reminder in the midst of the work that I do in my own lived experience to embrace joy and to surround those who are important to me and who I meet and encounter with joy as well as a counter narrative to those realities. But joy can also be a reality. So, yeah.
Thanks for that closing thought.
Yeah.
Have a good night, everyone.
Take care,
Have a good
everyone.
night.